In general, when talking about World War II, little is said about the true first fascist. Although his figure has been overshadowed historically by Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, who ruled Italy from 1922 to 1943, also brutally killed thousands of people and actively participated on the Axis side. After being executed on April 28, 1945, his body and that of his lover, Clara Petacci, were displayed and subjected to all kinds of humiliations in a square in Milan.
Killed Mussolini. The bodies of the ex-dictator, his mistress, and fellow fascists were left lying in the square, and the enraged Italians took the opportunity of kicking them and flinging rubbish on them.
In today's video, we will explore Mussolini's figure, his biography, his rise and fall from power, and his tragic and deserved end, executed by an oppressed people. Get ready to travel to Italy in the early 20th century in another exciting installment of military history. Let's begin. In ancient Rome, the word fasces referred to a weapon consisting of a bundle of wooden rods, sometimes even containing the edge of an axe. Used by Roman authorities to punish offenders, fasces came to symbolize the authority of the state. In the 19th century, Italians began using the word to designate political groups united by common goals. This violent symbol would be the origin of fascism, founded by today's video protagonist. Benito Andrea Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883 in Predappio, a small town in central Italy. Born into a humble family, his father was a blacksmith and his mother a schoolteacher. Benito grew up with stories of nationalism and political heroism from his socialist father. Solitary and socially awkward, he got into trouble at an early age due to his intransigence and violence towards his classmates. He studied teaching and became a teacher, a profession that would later serve him in journalism. As a young man, he moved to Switzerland and became a declared socialist. Over time, he returned to Italy, having been expelled from Switzerland for joining radicalized political groups, and established himself as a journalist. Mussolini founded several newspapers, honing the propaganda that he would later use as a tool during fascism. He even wrote in his articles that it would have been necessary to shoot half a dozen deputies to set a healthy example for other partisans. When World War I broke out in 1914, Italy remained neutral. However, Mussolini wanted his nation to join the conflict, leading to a clash with the Italian Socialist Party, which expelled him for supporting the war. In response, he formed his own political movement, the Fasci of Revolutionary Action, whose goal was to encourage entry into the war. Eventually, Italy joined the First World War in 1915. Mussolini became increasingly convinced that society should not be organized based on social class or political affiliation, but around a strong national identity. He believed that only a ruthless and energetic dictator could cleanse Italy and restore its national promise. To achieve this, he began fostering this sentiment in the youth to gain support. This would be a strategy he would maintain throughout his political career, as seen in the following material. While he was not yet the revered figure we have just seen in the footage, after the war, Mussolini was not alone. Many Italians were disgruntled by the Treaty of Versailles. They felt that the agreement, which redistributed the territory of aggressor nations, did not respect Italy by giving it too little land. Slowly, a breeding ground of discontent was forming. ideal for the violence that was to come. In 1919, Mussolini founded a paramilitary movement called the Italian Combat Fasci, a combat-focused squad intended to mobilize war-hardened veterans who could restore glory to Italy. Mussolini hoped to translate the nation's discontent into political success, but the fledgling party suffered a humiliating defeat in the parliamentary elections that year, garnering only 2,420 votes, compared to the 1.02 million of the Socialist Party. This pleased his enemies in Milan, who celebrated a mock funeral in his honor. Undeterred, Mussolini began courting other groups opposed to the socialists. Industrialists and merchants fearing strikes and stoppages, rural landowners reluctant to lose their land, and members of political parties abhorring the growing popularity of socialism. These groups would become valuable support for the future Italian dictator's plan. Mussolini's powerful allies helped finance the paramilitary wing of his movement, known as the Black Shirts. Although Mussolini professed to be against oppression and censorship of any kind, the group soon became known for its willingness to use violence for political gain. The Black Shirts terrorized socialists and Mussolini's personal enemies throughout the country. The year 1920 was very bloody, with fascists marching through cities, beating and even killing union leaders, and de facto taking control of local authorities. However, the Italian government, which shared the fascist enmity towards socialists, did little to nothing to curb the violence. Here is archival footage of this paramilitary force. At the end of it, you can see how heavily armed they were. While Mussolini only controlled a fraction of the militias at that time, his image of toughness contributed to forging his reputation as a powerful and authoritarian leader, capable of backing up his words with violent and decisive actions. During this time, the nickname he had given himself began to popularize among his followers: Il Duce. The Duke wielded powerful influence over Italians, seducing them with his personal charm and persuasive rhetoric. In 1921, Mussolini won a seat in parliament and was even invited to join the coalition government by the Italian prime minister, who assumed that Mussolini would calm his black shirts once given a share of political power. However, the government had misjudged Mussolini, who instead intended to use his paramilitary forces to seize absolute control. By late 1921, Mussolini transformed his group into the National Fascist Party, turning a movement that had about 30,000 members in 1920 into a political party with 320,000 members in less than 2 years. Although he declared war on the state, the Italian government could not dissolve the party and remained on the sidelines as the fascists took over most of northern Italy. Mussolini saw the opportunity for the final blow in the summer of 1922. The socialists had announced a strike not in the name of workers' emancipation, but as a desperate cry for the state to end fascist violence. Mussolini managed to portray the strike as proof that the government was weak and unable to rule. With new supporters wanting law and order, Il Duce decided it was time to take power. On October 25, 1922, a day after his meeting in Naples with the authorities, Mussolini appointed 4 party leaders to lead their members to the country's capital. Poorly trained and ill-equipped, these men would likely have lost a battle with the Italian army, but Mussolini intended to intimidate the government into surrendering without sparking a civil war. The dictator had a charismatic power and popular support that shook the political elite in Rome. While Mussolini stayed in Milan, his supporters marched toward the Italian capital, leaving chaos and destruction in their wake, even taking over government buildings in several cities. Luigi Facta, the prime minister at the time, attempted to impose martial law, but the king believed that Mussolini could establish stability and refused to sign the order that would have mobilized Italian troops against the fascists. In protest, Facta and his cabinet resigned on the morning of October 28th. Armed with a telegram from the king inviting him to form a cabinet, Mussolini boarded a sleeping car and embarked on a calm and triumphant 14-hour journey from Milan to Rome. On October 30th, he became prime minister and ordered his men to parade past the king's residence as they left the city. For over 20 years, the dictator who had seized power by force would lead the Italian government. King Victor Emmanuel, exhausted by the World War and a state of almost civil war in Italy, had assumed that Mussolini would impose order. However, in 3 years, the Duke became an absolute dictator, displacing even the king from decision-making. Over time, Mussolini increased his own power while curtailing the civil rights of the population and creating a propagandistic police state. His agenda went beyond domestic affairs, as Mussolini's imperial ambitions led Italy to occupy the Greek island of Corfu, invade Ethiopia, and ally with Nazi Germany, ultimately resulting in the murder of 8,500 Italians in the Holocaust, and leaving Italy on the darker side of history. Here is footage of the dictator making the announcement of entering the war.
L'ora delle decisioni irrevocabili. La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori.
Mussolini's insatiable hunger for power would be his downfall, as his blindness led his country into World War II as part of the Axis, aligned with the seemingly unstoppable Adolf Hitler. This decision left the Italian nation destroyed and isolated for much of the 20th century. King Victor Emmanuel III, seeing the war already well advanced, convinced Mussolini's closest allies to turn against him. On July 25, 1943, they finally managed to remove him from power and place him under arrest. However, after a dramatic escape from prison, Mussolini fled to the Italian territory occupied by Germany, where, under Hitler's pressure, he signed a humiliating agreement, turning his nation into a weak and ephemeral puppet state. From that moment on, it would be a debacle for the Axis, particularly for Italy. On April 18, 1945, with the war already lost, one of the greatest acts of cowardice in military history occurred. Mussolini was in Milan participating in a meeting to plan resistance when news arrived that Waffen-SS General Karl Wolff had requested the cessation of hostilities on that same day. Il Duce adamantly refused to surrender, putting on a spectacle with much bluster, speaking of honor and courage. However, as the Italian Social Republic crumbled, Mussolini decided to escape, disguised as a soldier in a German convoy, like a rat. In his escape, the dictator left behind his wife, Rachel Guidi, and his 5 children, but took his lover, Clara Petacci, with him. At 6:30 in the morning on April 27, 1945, the convoy was detected near the province of Como by a group of communist partisans. After a fierce exchange of gunfire, the Nazis decided to surrender, as they had no loyalty or respect for Il Duce. The partisans allowed the withdrawal of the Germans in exchange for the surrender of all Italians. Around 7 in the evening, as the partisans were checking the documentation of the prisoners left behind after the Germans' departure, one of them recognized Mussolini and arrested him immediately. That night, news of the dictator's arrest reached Milan, and the one responsible for broadcasting it on the radio was the future president of the Republic, Sandro Pertini, who announced that the decision of the National Liberation Committee, or CLN, was that Mussolini should be shot like a rabid dog. The partisans transporting Il Duce and his lover stopped in the small town of Villa Belmonte, where both were led to a wall to be shot. In a first attempt, the weapons failed, but after the second, the lovers fell riddled with bullets. On April 28, 1945, the corpses were transported to Milan by truck. During the journey, no one was allowed to approach the bodies until they reached Loreto Square in the Lombard capital. There, Mussolini's corpse was brutally stoned, kicked, and shot, with some people even urinating on it. His face was completely disfigured, and after the beating, the police force composed of partisans and firefighters hung Mussolini, Petacci, and other fascist leaders upside down at a gas station in the square.
Firemen were called in to disperse the mob, who were by now, well, what shall we say, perhaps a trifle overexcited. The final ghastly scene was the hanging of the bodies upside down outside a petrol station. Well, at least it's a warning to all remaining fascists everywhere.
This act of revenge was a consequence of the humiliations suffered by the bodies of 15 anti-fascist partisans, which were hanged in the same place. Hours later, local CLN leaders decided to end the macabre display and remove the bodies, which were placed in wooden boxes with straw inside and buried in anonymous graves. Mussolini's tomb, lacking a name and identified only by the number 384, was desecrated on April 23, 1946, by a group of fascists who stole the body. This marked the beginning of an unusual journey for Il Duce's remains. Finally, on May 7th, one of the thieves, Domenico Laccisi, handed over the remains to Father Perini of the Milanese convent of Sant'Angelo. The corpse was placed in a tiny box, since several fingers and other body fragments were lost during constant transfers. The church and authorities then decided to hide the body in the Capuchin convent of Cerro Maggiore, where the superior first concealed it under an altar, and then, due to the bad odor, in a cupboard. The body of the once most powerful man in Italy remained there until 1957, when the government returned the remains to the widow. Since then, the dictator, or what's left of him, rests in the San Casiano Cemetery in Predappio, in the Emilia-Romagna region, precisely in the town where he was born in 1883. Mussolini's tomb has become a kind of tourist attraction and serves as a reminder of how brutal and devastating fascism was for the Italian nation. This concludes today's video. We appreciate you making it this far and look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.